Cocktails from above, drink recipes and the making of socialist heritage. In this second section of the conference, every panel is equipped with two discussants, two respondents to the paper. For this session, we're going to have Danielle Bender, University of Toronto, and Helmut Klug of Universität Graz. Chairing the session is Lisa Smith.
Thank you. Now that I have the bio, I would like to introduce Danielle as well. She is doing her PhD at New York University. She's an associate professor in the Department of French and Italian.
I got the PhD. They gave it to me a while ago. Yeah. I didn't sneak in, I promise. Yeah. I wish I was that clever. It would have saved me a lot of heartache.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, I mean, you could have just run with that.
Yeah, no.
Anyways, her teaching and research focuses on pre-modern Italian literature and food and beverage studies, which is always important. She's the author of Dante's Gluttons, Food and Society from the Convivio to the Comedy, which came out with Amsterdam University Press in 2022, and A Bite-Sized History of Italy, the New Press 2026.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to time myself. So thank you especially to Simone and Claudia for the organization and to everyone for the very rich discussions we've had so far. I apologize for the condition of my voice. Hopefully it sounds sexy and not really annoying and grating. I didn't add to my bio, but since we're spiraling in that direction anyway, I add that I'm the Italian editor for Wine Enthusiast magazine, where I taste about 5,000 wines a year for them. And I add that here because this context is relevant, but actually because based on our conversations yesterday, it seemed like it might be something interesting to talk about in terms of reproducibility and heritage. And then I realized that I was paired with someone talking about drinks culture. So if that might be a more interesting thread for us to pull on later, I'd be delighted to dive in. On the other side of that, however, I should really emphasize that I am a very traditional Dante scholar in every sense. I was brought up through the most kind of old school formation. I learned medieval Latin paleography. I got screamed at in front of all the other students in my Italian exams. Back in the old system where the professor just called upon you randomly and made you and interrogated you in front of your peers and then told you were stupid but maybe passed you anyway. So all of that is, yeah. All of that is to say that I cut my chops the hard way, but then when I started working on my dissertation and later work, I wanted to work on food in Dante. And as radical as that may sound, it would be useful to remember that Dante is most famous for the Divine Comedy, but his second most famous work is the Convivio, which is the banquet. His most famous sonnet from his early from the Vita Nuova is a representation of his love affair with Beatrice as her eating his heart. Many of his early kind of banter, frenemy poetry with his young friends in Florence feature things like lines where he says, "You're going to choke on your loin of mutton," or "get trussed up in knots of other luxurious foods, etc. So the theme was very strong, but the pushback was yet stronger. People in the world of literary studies, and especially Dante studies, did not find this to be convincing at all. And so it took me a long time to get people to think about this in a way that seemed both fruitful and conversant. And I lay that all out because everyone here understands that side of it, but I'm going to try to produce for you some of the other side of it in the hopes that it will bring together our conversation because we've had such an incredible amount of the legwork and philology and collection of raw data that has been in service to the work that I can do, and then so much of the exciting things that happen when you apply that on the other end, and I'm kind of trying to be a linchpin here in that sense. In the Italian context in particular, this is important because when we're understanding the construction of Italian identity in a place that never had a point of reference, centralized government, or any kind of roots up attempt at formulating a political identity, the enogastronomic cultural identity was something that was relied upon very heavily historically and really still now. What I'm looking at today, the Liber de Coquina, is a book that is familiar for people who study recipes, but not for people who study literature. And so that's the tension that I'm interested in. In a way, I might say it's the story of a recipe for a recipe. So I depart from this famous open letter that the Emperor Frederick II, who's 1194 to 1250 are his years. His reign is 1220 to 1250. The encyclical is called To the Masters of the Bolognese Studio, and he describes in it culture as the condimentum of power, a characterization that through its Latin root awards culture the double role of both the adornment of power and its foundation. In fact, Frederick's court is what has long been and remains held as a rarefied space of intellectual exchange that fostered cultural production of all kinds, from the invention of the sonnet to the introduction of Fibonacci numbers to the emperor's autograph treatise on falconry. That's where you see the one picture of him always and with his little bird. And Frederick is celebrated for his insatiable curiosity and relative indifference to especially religious orthodoxies. But of the cultural condiments he used to both establish and embellish his reign, one of his contributions has remained very little studied by the historians and people who care about these more important contributions, I should say specifically. The Liber by itself has been sort of extracted from that space. And that is, of course, the Liber de Coquina. Produced at Frederick's court alongside the other great markers of progress that earned him the moniker Stupor Mundi, the recipe collection has not been much appreciated for its place in the emperor's cultural political program. The limited attention that this archetypal culinary text has received belies the significance of Frederick's own attention to food culture and his commission of such a project. If the other inventions of Frederick's court were conceived as tools of soft power meant to engender hegemony and reinforce a power structure, the cookbook might be seen as another arrow in this imperial quiver, capitalizing on the unique communicative potential of enogastronomic touchstones. The cookbook genre, born in this case with an imperial imprimatur, was positioned to become a tool for political maneuvering with an authority anchored in its inception at this medieval court, but also the flexibility of a medium built around what we know is the familiarity and intimacy of what and how we eat, like a shard of a speculum principis, but one that used the universally accessible, recognizable figures of food and wine, that the cookbook in turn became a map for connecting a gastronomic gesture to a political agenda that could later be exploited. And I don't think I'll have time to talk about that today, but as you can imagine, I use this in context with and in dialogue with people like Dante, who then lift from this book, knowing that other people would have read it, been familiar with it, and by virtue of that, have a kind of quick shorthand to say things that might not otherwise have been easy to communicate to a not literate in the, at the time, defined way, and even now today, a defined way. Just for a little more context, Italian food has been studied with a decent amount of attention now at this point. It was a long time where people in Italian studies, I think, felt extremely nervous about it because there was a lot of dilettantism, and there are a lot of books that were like, pizza and pasta, yay, and this will definitely sell, without necessarily having any academic rigor behind it. I think everybody knows that you can bring true academic rigor to anything, and the same amount of care put into, I've seen work done on Beyonce that's much more convincing to me than on Beowulf, but there's that said, for Italians, the sensitivity has, I think, created a stronger boundary. But the cookbook, I think, suffered particularly because it's considered to be non-literary. It's a real shame, basically. This indifference literary scholars have shown toward cookbooks has prevented them from tapping a vast landscape of highly popular, widely circulated texts, even as people from many other fields have enjoyed great success in digging into them. Everything from the material form of the text to the paratext incorporated therein, to the marginalia associated with them, to broader collection practices and beyond can reveal values and ideas governing not just the cookbook, but the community that produces it and how they interact with it. Like food, culinary texts reflect and respond to social, economic, and political realities of their historical moment, but unlike actual food, the relative durability of the text, and very importantly, the act of inscribing, choosing to record something for posterity, make the cookbook a valuable, if curated, window into the otherwise ephemeral world of gastronomy. The way I explain it to my students is, you don't post on Instagram the glass of water and the Cliff Bar you had for breakfast. You post on Instagram the plate from the Michelin-starred restaurant you had and the cocktail with the CO2 cloud coming out of it. And, you know, the way... with that in mind, by studying the cookbook and its contents, it is possible to learn not only about social values, customs, and perceptions of taste, but as through all written records, and here I think we can talk a lot about the tension, again, between oral and written, about what people found worthy of historical attention and desired to have others know about them. On the other hand, the absence of information points to objects of disdain and practices considered unwelcome within a community, and no gastronomic heresies that could mark someone as beyond the bounds of the civilized or the integrated. Archival and philological reconstructions provide the foundation that might facilitate that research. I note the work of our colleagues that has been presented in these very days, among many other fantastic projects, as well as the wealth of information that particularly Italian scholars do. Italians love to go into the archives, dig stuff up, transcribe it, and make it available. They rarely do anything after that. So that's great news for anybody who wants to come here and grab it all up and use it. This work has not typically been perceived as consciously developed tools. These cookbooks in particular have not been perceived as consciously developed tools in a grander plan of cultural political cohesion. The most famous counter example to this is one that everybody knows because the name is used so much, even if they don't really know the origin of it. It's Artusi, La scienza in cucina e l'arte di mangiar bene, the 1891 self-published cookbook by the amateur cook who decided that with a very consciously set out to collect recipes from all over the country. He crowdsourced the recipes, put them all together, and said, this is an attempt to show how we are all one Italian state with an Italian culture that is deeply linked to our Italian cuisine. And he's not unclear about that. This was observed by scholars following that. Piero Camporesi famously said, in a discrete, subterranean, impalpable way, first in the kitchen and then in the collective unconscious, in the unfathomed depths of the popular mind, Artusi's text unified and blended the motley collection of peoples only formally identified as Italians. With the calculated exploitation of the cookbook format, La scienza in cucina intended to reach the hearts of the not quite yet Italian people through their stomachs. Artusi's project is, as you can imagine, very relevant here. and not just because of the broad strokes you can see, but also because Artusi was himself aware of this past. He knew about the texts that came before this. He knew about even the Liber de Coquina. He understood that there was a trajectory and there was a kind of a template to follow. If we look at Frederick II and his Liber de Coquina, we can see how he's conceived it as a subtle weapon that could influence behaviors and set standards. This was important to him at that time because he was the emperor of a sprawling and disjointed reign with territories all over what is today Germany and France and North Italy, as well as down through the south of the peninsula and beyond. The cookbook in this way became an inscriber of social anatomies and naturalizer of hierarchies, but one whose chameleon-like nature allowed it to grow and shift like the taxonomic systems it tracked. There are a couple of things that have kept the cookbook outside of the realm of what people are interested, this particular cookbook, Liber de Coquina and Frederick's influence on it, outside of people's interest here. One is that it was very hard to reconstruct its the genealogy of the text. And I think this speaks very well to what we were talking about yesterday. There were so many copies of them and so many people who believed that the only trajectory was from basically smallest to largest, rather than there having been probably something somewhat more rhizomoic happening, that it was hard to understand where it's from. It seems now that the consensus is that it was commissioned at his court sometime between 1230 and 1250, and the vast web of copies that proliferated all over the Italian peninsula and the rest of the continent in various vernaculars and multiple Latin copies all come from that place. Incidentally, while there may still be reason to doubt this perfect genealogy, the echoes of the cookbook in things like contemporary literature and other creative production, frescoes, painting, etc., are a way for us to also help with dating. We can know that if somebody had access to something like this and someone like Dante quotes quite directly from this text, it must have had some iteration that was available at that time. So that those actually putting those two things back in conversation also further helps us on the side of better philology. The other reason is that Frederick was infamous for his disdain for continental affairs. So for a while, nobody really cared about anything that he was doing. He didn't really fit very neatly with 19th century nation-state building, and he was most celebrated for being his grandfather's grandson, Roger II, who was, I think, really should just be called simply an Orientalist, but sometimes people sort of extrapolate that into someone who actually knew things about the Arabic world. That doesn't seem to be the case, and to be sure, both Frederick and Roger were people who cherry-picked the things that they thought were beautiful and cosmopolitan from North Africa and the Near East. They didn't know, neither one, certainly Frederick didn't have Arabic, and neither one of them really interacted with them, and they had no problem with being extremely violent towards the Islamic community, both at the individual level and the large one, expelling them in Roger famously in 1160, even after he had recreated his court in the style of these same leaders. That being said, the feeling was that Frederick had Sicily at the heart of the Mediterranean, looking out south and east, technically, and not interested in what was happening on the continent. Those barriers mean that people have not looked very carefully at the text, but if you do, and I'm not going to go too much into detail here because I'm the one who cares about the literature part, not you guys, but it's structured in a way that makes it clear that it is his intention for it to be received as an important book. It is not a jumble of information. It is presented in a with a format that allows people to do things like memorize the text easily, which would have been very important in a pre-modern moment. So with people not being able to circulate actual hard copies of things, you could read it, pass it on, and it had, at the same time, many practical elements folded into it, which show us that there was a kind of team effort at play, real chefs who actually knew how to do this stuff, but by putting it in a book, we know that it's not for anybody who's using it in the kitchen, because nobody is actually handwriting manuscripts that are going to be in a kitchen at that time. I don't think I have to tell you how filthy and hot it was. Given that, yeah, I know, I gotcha. Thank you. So given that with this structure in place, in commissioning the Liber and bringing it to life in this form, Frederick did more than simply elevate a collection of recipes into the canon of princely sciences and scholarly interests. As the first time food and preparation techniques had been awarded the honor of being recorded in Latin at an emperor's request, the Liber set the standard for what the cookbook genre was and could be. Its attention to consuming practices of any kind fit neatly into the tradition of the Specula Principum, and first and foremost, the creation of a cookbook at the imperial court helped to cement a gastronomic component as essential to an elite or courtly education for the complete man. But Frederick, who had been handed a disconnected jumble of territories stretched from the continent to the Mediterranean, would have been interested most in the role food could play in his attempt to properly inhabit the throne he had been given. With his talent for identifying avenues through which to wield influence, he would have seen that while knowing how to eat well, like being an accomplished hunter or an amateur astronomer, condire, or dress power, far more important was the fact that by controlling food and dining culture, one could condere, or construct power. Being seen as the source of nourishment denoted Frederick as the great provisioner of his people, fulfilling his most essential role as their leader. Cultivating the culinary arts in this way, he showed that he had not simply inherited power, but was rightly given it, as one who knew what to do with it. And just with my last second, I wanted to say that paying attention to Liber de Coquina has implications that go way beyond the medieval Palermitan court and even beyond Artusi. Engagement with the text prompts a broader interrogation of and an opportunity to improve upon existing methodologies in medieval studies and literary studies for me, but I think that we can certainly expand that way beyond. The means, if food itself is transitory, the texts that record food occupy an amphibious space as both manuals and historical chronicles, and are notoriously difficult to read because of how much you have to know in order to get into them. But what they also allow us to do is interact with each other in a much more fluid way, in a space where people with different formations and different backgrounds don't necessarily have the same academic tools or even just cultural tools to interact. All humans in all times and all places must eat in order to stay alive, and as a result, food and the texts that track it have a penetrating depth that encourages an ample and flexible scholarly gaze. And I think just to leave us with one more thought, that it's a reminder, particularly as somebody who started as a student in a very traditional field and tried to push out of it and find another way, this is a text that has been considered unliterary mostly because food is effeminate, is a part of a working class or popular class genre. It has not been deemed trustworthy in this sense, but also because literacy has been defined in a very specific way, a very hemmed-in way. And so I like to use this as one example of an opportunity to interrogate the structures and hopefully continue our rich conversation with all of the tools that you've given us. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce Diana, and I'm sorry if I butcher this. I forgot to ask you, Mincyte? Mincyte. Okay, she's an associate professor of sociology at City University of New York. She's been trained in rural sociology and science and tech studies. She studies the interface between food and the state by examining informal foods, automation in agro-food systems, and family and care labor in food economies. Her most recent research focuses on raw milk, food sovereignty in Europe's borderlands, and the role of ideology in Soviet food culture. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and for this really generative and deep discussion. I feel like we are going really, really, really to the knacks and crooks and what's the expression in English? In the very, very, very far, just deeply in there. So I'll be talking about socialist cocktails, and it has this very comparativist dimension that a lot of us in this room are bringing with the historical work and more explicitly with Regina's and Michelle's work to distill something from it that tells more about the contemporary kind of food landscape and heritage. So thinking from the Soviet perspective, which is very different politically and economically, highlights, I think, three dimensions to the current debates in this room. First of all, I think it really emphasizes the role of the state and state power. Regulations, ideologies set the stage, what is available, in what form is acceptable, not acceptable, and power is central for recipe making and heritage making. Secondly, it highlights this tension between what is a failed and successful heritage making and what is a successful and not successful recipe. And finally, it has this question of capitalism and or Western kind of trajectory of development of recipes, and how do we think about them in a context that doesn't have the kind of consumer culture that we understand in the West, or commodities as objects with a very specific value systems embedded in them. There is no tourism. Rural populations in the Soviet Union didn't get citizen passports until the 70s, restricted mobilities. How does that regionalism heritage is operating in that context? And also an ideological ambiguity about the taste. What if the recipes are not made to be tasty, because that went against the socialist idea of proletarian nutritionism and emphasizing that it has to be good and nutritious for the body, but nothing more than that. So what does that mean to make recipes that are not tasty? So with that in mind, I will talk about a very specific category in cookbooks, what seem to be undrinkable, and my family called them undrinkable cocktails. Up until 1990, recipe books were among the most sought-after consumer goods in the Soviet Union, printed in really limited numbers and in high demand by working women. They really rarely reached bookstores, and they were always shared basically through informal economy, where you have to depend on your networks to get them. In the post-World War II Baltic states, these cookbooks carried even greater significance. The region had suffered some of the highest wartime and post-war casualties brought about by 3 rounds of colonization by the Soviet Union, 1940, 1944, Nazi Germany, 1941 to 44, the Holocaust, prosecutions, famines, deportations, and more than a decade of violence surrounding the mass partisan war that reached the levels of Vietnam. This is not to make it sound as a victimhood. This is about stating the kind of disruption in the transfer of cultural knowledge and the atomization of the household as a unit and being kind of separated, operating in this very isolated space. And if you lose your mother and a grandmother, where do you get the recipes? So these cookbooks emerged not only as practical guides for those who needed to learn to cook, but also vehicles for constructing narratives of home, comfort, and normalcy for the first generation of cooking in apartments with tiny wooden kitchens or no kitchens at all, for people who just really moved from the villages, escaping collectivization. So it is against this historical backdrop that the curious category of alcoholic drink recipes was inserted into otherwise conventional cookbooks filled with familiar regional dishes. combining ingredients such as beer, vodka, Soviet versions of cognac, fermented bread drinks. In Lithuanian, the agira. In Slavic languages that we know abroad is called kvass, as well as sour cream, milk, eggs. These concoctions were and continue to be viewed as impractical at best and as symbols of the outlandishness and absurdity even of Soviet cultural politics at worst. So let me give, which computer I'm working with? I guess I have another device. So this is a cookbook published again in 1971 from Lithuania, and this is all the recipe for a milk and wine cocktail that doesn't even have a description what to do with the recipe, with the ingredients. That is 2 glasses of milk, 1 glass of beer wine, which, by the way, was not sold in stores, made at home semi-legally because you could be punished for having it, and 2 egg yolks, and probably a teaspoon of sugar. So, so these are the kinds of recipes that were in these books. So they can be interpreted at first as manifestations of a doomed modernist project, an attempt by the socialist state to superimpose new traditions by combining local ingredients into novel drinks, even if they lacked both historical precedent and the supporting public narratives that make culinary innovations legible. In this sense, they indeed stood in stark contrast to Western cocktails that, while invented by enterprising individuals, primarily in the United States, tapped into the ethos of cosmopolitan leisure and exotic escapism to create a vibrant cocktail culture. Think of tiki drinks. In the Soviet context, the expectation that the newly urbanized citizens, many of whom came straight from villages with some of the most diverse beer traditions in Europe, would suddenly begin serving drinks like this in their homes was almost unthinkable. Yet this approach overlooks the Soviet state's notable successes in cultivating national dishes that were genuinely embraced by its citizens and remain popular today. In Lithuania, the large potato dumplings known as zeppelins, for their resemblance to airships, for this very important longest flight that the Lithuanian diaspora members made to be shot in Germany, in Nazi Germany by the border, that created this very important narrative of Lithuanianness based on this airship and modernity, and with the ingredients that were very widely available during the Soviet times, because that was what you would grow in your plot that you have, the very nutritious potato, or what Francesca Bry calls this para-commodity underpinning industrial agriculture of tubers, that the availability made this dish during the Soviet times as the national symbol, the national dish, even as there were many regional contenders in the 30s before the independence. So the Soviets did create national heritage, but not with the drinks. So recognizing this unevenness in heritage making, this paper argues that socialist drink recipes failed to take root as culinary heritage precisely because they exposed rather than resolved or helped put them together the deep social, cultural, economic, and political tensions that define Soviet agro-food politics. So the first tension centers on the relationship between strong national identities and socialist internationalism. The Soviet state sought to domesticate nationalist attachments while simultaneously using them to legitimate its own cultural project. Food became a key means for negotiating this balance. Conceptualizing the Soviet project in terms of the empire of national cultures, Francine Hirsch has shown how the Soviets tapped into folklore and the attendant imagined cultural heritage, leading to the creation of this carefully curated set of sanctioned national food practices in the broader narrative of internationalism. In other republics, As in Lithuania, this process involved homogenizing regional diversity into this very narrow, emblematic national dishes such as zeppelins. With the drinks, that did not quite happen. They put these recipes from combining these very different ingredients from different republics, including Armenian cognac or Georgian wine, and making them part of the recipes and making them very difficult to obtain, so it kind of didn't make sense. So the second tension concerns the projection of progress and modernity against the backdrop of continued reliance on practices of self-provisioning and domestic resourcefulness. Cultivating nearly all their vegetables, berries, and fruits in small peri-urban gardens, known as dachas by the Russian term, the new urbanites resembled urban peasants more than modern socialist subjects envisioned by state ideology. In the countryside, every collective farm worker was forced to keep a plot of land where they were required to produce milk and pork and eggs. In Lithuania in 1980s, 95% of all eggs produced in Lithuania was produced in small plots, in the individual, not on the industrial scale. So that was a very important sector. But all the talk about becoming progress and modernity flew into the face of actual experience of being this producer and doing everything in your small world. So to those working double shifts, one in modern factories, another during the weekends or in the evenings in their homes and dachas, these acts of culinary imagination often felt like a joke or even an insult. These recipes' symbolic access only underscore divergence of proclaimed prosperity from everyday reality. And most importantly, in my reading, from an ideological perspective, cookbooks posed a challenge to the proletarian ethos of the state. From the early days of Bolshevik Russia, Soviet food policy sought to modernize eating habits through centralized planning, nutritional science, and public dining. Decrees and various campaigns, such as the 1923 pamphlet, Down with the Private Kitchen, then envisioned the collectivization of daily meals in canteens and communal dining halls as part of the socialist revolution. Within this framework, taste has to be disciplined. Eating should be functional, nutritious, and efficient, rather than a matter of pleasure or individual taste. Yet the socialist cookbooks quietly unsettled this vision as it invited readers into a space of sensory indulgence and hospitality. At the same time, the assumption of recipe books that women were the primary cooks sat uneasily alongside the socialist promise to emancipate them from domestic labor, which initially included the efforts to abolish family as a social unit, a very radical first year's attempt to dissociate family from operating as nuclear family, but actually dissolve it altogether. While official policy emphasized women's liberation through socialized care and collective dining, the recipes themselves reaffirmed traditional gender roles, turning the home into a site of ideological maintenance rather than emancipation. The drink recipes reveal these tensions with embedded gendered references to the readers and home cooks. They all are referred to as females, even as drinking hard liquors was associated with men. So to illustrate these points, I would like to provide an analysis of one cookbook published in Lithuania in 1971 called Our Dishes. It is again a very kind of reference, very kind of has this underlying nationalist narrative, again surprising in the context of the Soviet internationalism. And what you see is the Zeppelins on the first cover of the page, and then these are the bedare, this potato sausages again. The potato kind of replacing all the grain-based diets and making the kind of very similar culinary heritage across the region, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. So this book significantly departs from earlier books in that it includes the dish commonly prepared at home. So this is the first book that it doesn't kind of push back. So I really don't have much time. So a brief methodological note was that I have not had a chance, or I could not find somebody who could have helped me to connect with the authors of these books and context or archival materials, how they were produced, who looked at these recipes. So all of this is from the perspective of reading from the outside and the context. And it also gives us a lot of the kind of challenges, of methodological challenges of working with cookbooks, because they were at the bottom of the publishing houses lists and made them very kind of irrelevant and leaving very few traces of how they were produced. So in my paper, I cover 3 recipes, and let's start with the first one. The first one is Bocho Ancestors Drink. It includes beer, 700 grams, sour cream, eggs, 2, sugar, and yields 1 kilo, which actually it's an important point because it doesn't add up to a kilo. And that actually, about 25% of all of the recipes don't add up. Recipes are instructions kind of jump between one under the other. You kind of, at the end of the recipe, you realize, oh, cognac goes after like the second ingredient. So it's really a question of resources, probably, who was copy editing and how much time they had, what was the kind of pressures to produce it. But it also maybe draws on this kind of sense that people know what they're doing and they have the embedded skills. But again, it's really interesting to see this littered with mistakes. So you beat the eggs with sugar until foamy, add sour cream, stir gently, and pour into the beer. Stir before drinking, prepare directly in mugs or glasses. Well, how do you stir in mugs or glasses? But that's a different question. So from this recipe, sour cream is available, eggs and sugar, not so much. Eggs are unaffordable because they are very expensive. You use it for everything and very sparingly. You don't experiment with cooking because you value the eggs, that when you are cooking, it's the most expensive product in urban households. And sugar is very, very, very difficult to get because on dachas you produce all these berries. And you need to conserve them for the winter because there is no conserves, there is no canned products to buy. So all of the jams and everything. So there is no sugar as such. So you have to have informal economy helping you to find these products. So it immediately says, this is very familiar taste. And then you kind of have troubles making it, but also it has like this beating the eggs, which at that time in the 70s, nobody had mixers, so it's a work with the fork. My mom got her first mixer that was not a crank one in 1990, electric one. She was making cakes, all beating with her fork. So to actually, for some cocktail to beat eggs, that it's very expensive and you do this, it's not very realistic. In addition to being a very kind of peculiar taste that you see of the eggs and that. So the second cocktail is Ruth, liquor that is honey-based, champagne, sparkling wine that was coming from newly built berry processing plant that started producing sparkling wine in Lithuania. So it kind of draws on the emerging new kind of product. Liqueur Palanga, it's a bitter with Rowan, strawberry syrup, ice cube, rose spring. Rose are mildly toxic, but they are national plant of Lithuania, national flower, and that is very interestingly highlights this national heritage. It's also, this cocktail brings this very aesthetic part. When you put a little green on with the Lithuanian sign, it has a very kind of strong emotional presentation. Ice cube is the issue here because the refrigerators were not really functioning very well at the time. We had our first refrigerator in our household in 1969. So this is just 2 years after, and they did not work well. And to produce an ice cube was the last thing that you would do with the freezer that was thawing and not working properly. So it's again this kind of very aspirational to a certain extent, and it highlights this kind of tensions in these recipes. The third one is a coffee drink, which is probably the most puzzling because it uses the fermentation, bread fermentation, the kvass or gira in Lithuanian method to bring in coffee, could be natural or instant, water, sugar, yeast, raisins, apple juice, cognac. Cognac would be Armenian. You would never mix it. This is the pride telling you that this cognac, you have some connections to get Armenian cognac. You will not put into this at all on your table. Coffee did not exist as such because of the kind of the place of the Soviet economy where it was at the time. The kinds of food networks that would deliver them would end in Moscow, but never would reach the provinces or republics. Raisins too. Raisins are coming from Central Asia and the Caucasus, also not very easy to find. And again, this requires to make coffee. Again, people don't know how to make coffee. So pour boiling water over ground natural coffee beans and let it seep, then strain the liquid, not coffee, strain the liquid. In case of instant coffee, sediment-free, that explains what that is. Pour boiling water over it and let it cool. Pour the prepared coffee into the apple juice, add yeast, mix with sugar and raisins, leave for 20 to 24 hours in a warm place to ferment, then carefully pour off the liquid so it does not get cloudy. Distribute liquid into the bottles or other containers. Add raisins, but I thought raisins were over there as well. If bottling, put one raisin in each bottle, cork the bottles, leave them in a warm room for 4 to 6 hours, then move them to cold room. After 20, 24 hours, the gira can be consumed, but cognac needs to be added before bottling. So it's, these recipes are just kind of like out there. So what do we make out of this, and what do they mean? And that's the arguments that I hope to make is in the form of questions rather than in the form of closed arguments, because of where I am in the process of writing this paper. Is there something about the drink's materiality or liquidity that make it very difficult to make it into a heritage? They mix a lot of ingredients. They don't stabilize the meaning as easily as food like potatoes. There might be something there. It's also connects really with yesterday's panel and many talks about moving beyond focusing on imaginaries and representative space to seeing heritage as lived experiences in a particular historical and social context and infrastructures, and that we really need the tools for non-capitalist heritage making that is very different. And the paradox of it all is that actually these drinks, even as outlandish as they look, they're actually much closer to historical drinks of the 16th, 17th century that combine these kinds of ingredients and blur the boundary between the drink and food than the cocktails that we think of, these very heritage cocktails of the modern, mostly American origins. So that's it. Questions? Thank you.
But let me introduce Dan Bender, the Canada Research Chair in Food and Culture and Professor of Food Studies at the University of Toronto in the Culinary Research Centre and Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences. He's the author most recently of The Food Adventurers, How Around the World Travel Changed the Way We Eat, and co-editor with Simone of Food Mobilities, Making World Cuisines. He's the current president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society and a member of the editorial collective of Gastronomica.
And that is the last time I'll be introduced in this entire conference, but we'll test you on that later. Thank you so very much for these wonderful papers, in the spirit of it being a new and friendlier field no one is going to yell at you. Well, I'm not. Helmut might. We will see. We hold out the possibility of still being yelled at. I found both of these papers to be enormously generative, and I take them together to be an invitation really to expand the conversation that we began with your paper, Lisa, and yours, Regina, about the questions of vernacular and about language and about translation, and also to start thinking about the somatic. Right? How do recipes act upon us, which I find is a question that food studies scholars don't think enough about, but we'll get to that. Danielle, you talked about the tension of literature and recipes, and I found that very, very well described. And I take that tension as an invitation to think about language and to continue that discussion of the vernacular. This is where that notion of the condimentum of power is really useful and makes me think about the number of condiments in my fridge and the total lack of power that I have. But it also leads to that question of, as you put it, those culinary, gastronomic gestures and their relationship to a political agenda. And I'm going to think about that in very physical and very material ways, right? An agenda as something that is, written down. I kept that right ready for us. And gestures as something that doesn't exist purely in metaphoric way, but real things, right? And the real gestures that come, the physicality of writing something down, of sharing it, of sharing those words, the physical experience of memorizing and sometimes forgetting a recipe, and then, of course, the physicalities of cooking a recipe and eating the recipe, and all the physicalities from digestion to waste and everything that follows. And all of that, I think we need to understand within that world of gastronomic gestures. There's a challenge in this fascinating paper, and I see this as non-synonyms, right? And they're non-synonyms that I think have run throughout our conversations in this conference today and yesterday, and likely tomorrow, that I think are worth thinking through. The dish is not the same thing as a recipe, and recipes, plural, is not the same thing as a cookbook. And that's something that really needs theorizing. And let's focus on dish and recipes. Conference about recipes. To taste a dish does not necessarily mean acknowledging the cookbook or the political power behind it. Can you therefore see the dish, and when you use the word dish in there, can we see that as a success of the cookbook and simultaneously a failure of the cookbook, the dish that ends up on the table? And I'm looking at you, Daniel, and your cookbooks and your dishes. Where is the acknowledgement of the gesture behind it? Where does the cookbook end, the recipe end, and the dish begin? Maybe that's the way of putting it. The culinary text, and pushing here into the connections between the literary study and culinary study, which operate really in different places of the body. And here we need to think about the language, right? And one of the things that I've been really struck on in the last few months really is thinking about, and here's your own experience of wine tasting, is that our ability to taste and to discern differences in taste far outstrips our abilities to articulate that in words. We're so much better at tasting than we are at writing. And historically, biologically, I tend to think that that's the case. And this is particularly magnified in a pre-modern world where the language that someone writes in may not be the language that somebody cooks in. or cooks with, or cooks through, and various other prepositions that don't work well for food. And I think that is really interesting to think about the translations that are happening in this cookbook, the translations of combining it, the decisions on the particular Latin-ish, and then the translations that might have happened if this cookbook was ever meant to be gesturally translated from recipe to dish. That I see as that wonderful idea of code switching that I think is a powerful tool throughout. And that leads me, through no real effective segue, but of course across hundreds of years and a whole new geography, to your wonderful paper. And part of the reason I really enjoyed this paper is two reasons. One, because of the ways in which you're thinking about the questions of socialist heritage, but also the ways in which you're introducing the idea of the somatic. Here's another one of my hobby horses. One of my hobby horses is that scholars, including food studies scholars, tend to still operate with the idea of the Enlightenment individual. Occasionally they eat. We rarely think about them digesting, and we almost never think about waste and excretion. And never do we ever consider that the historical subject might be drunk, right? And that's a presumption of drunkenness as the aberration, as a moment of leisure. And I think that this is a really important thing for us to question. How do people really operate, given that we've all had coffee, given that we're all on some level slightly stimulated, and we're all looking forward to alcohol later, at least I am. So you mention in this context this question of materiality. And here I want to push this idea of recipes as things that indirectly act upon us, right? They have a somatic, not simply sensory effect, but a somatic effect. You mentioned materiality, but one of the things that's so powerful about your paper is this question of this is uncookable, or at least was unproducible at the time. And that leads us to the question of immateriality. And that relationship of the material to the immaterial, I think it really extends our understanding of heritage in powerful ways. But language, too, operates here. And here I will finish up. There is a substitution here, my words, and Jeff's words, of a variety of different words. And I want to locate a few. One are some of those European words like champagne and cognac that operate as kind of ghosts. What is the politics behind those words and their translation? And the other is cocktail. And the question of whether this, to understand your translation of it, but also those cookbooks' translation of it, especially, this is a personal thing, because in my own work, in Michelle's book, thinking about those tiki cocktails as deliberately anti-communist impacts. And the question is does this become part of that? Is this about a fiction of drink, a fiction of leisure? Is it about remaking this spirit, not of just drink, but of drunkenness within the socialist state?
All right, I'll turn this over now to Helmut Klug, the Research Data Management Coordinator at the University of Graz Library, where he heads the support desk, the university's RDM training, and the Data Steward course. Before that, he worked as a researcher at the University of Graz, deeply rooted in digital humanities, German medieval studies, and cultural history, focusing on the culinary traditions of the Middle Ages.
Thank you very much. I also want to start off with a general comment, especially as I do not feel qualified to say anything here at this moment about these papers, but I will try. the general thought I want to remind you of, most basically, is that the recipes and their transmission are embedded in a historical cultural background. And when we are working with this historical material, it doesn't matter if it's medieval or more or less contemporary. It is a different background than ours. And we are conceiving the text from a different point of view. And our point of view obviously shapes how we deal with the historical content. But what I have seen when closely working with the German medieval recipes is that we must not mix these both time strands, because they do not mix. It doesn't work. And so I want to talk about my special field, because this is what I can talk about. And it's not modeling the recipes, but it's a little bit of a little bit about the cultural background of German medieval recipes. And in these times, these texts were practical knowledge. Before these texts have been recorded, the German transmission starts about 1350 with the Book of Good Food. This knowledge has been handed down orally. There were no written artifacts that can be found, and it was what Danielle said, the genealogy of the cookbooks is wanting to argue genealogy of historical cookbooks is probably not a good idea, because it doesn't work out. Simply because there is no ancestor that we can find. It might go along with the theories that there are for the literature, but when I can't prove what I'm talking about, I think the argument is moot. Yeah, the texts were the conservation of knowledge, so that this knowledge doesn't get lost. Why did people want to have the knowledge conserved? Because at this time, at least in the German lands, the Black Plague was moving around, and people were dropping on all sides. And with every person, knowledge got lost. And this is why, from one day to another, cooking recipes came into the center of interest. What I didn't say, knowledge literature has a broad range. It starts with the medical treatises in Latin, of course, and later then in the vernacular. It covers wine conservation, and on the other field it reaches, for example, horse medicine. It's stuff, ideas, knowledge you need for the everyday life. This is not what normally was recorded, because this recording process was very expensive. So, from a German cooking recipe point of view, I cannot see that these recipes were used to build an identity. What we can see, and from the historical sources that has been handed down, there also is not something we could call a cookbook genre at the time, because these texts were written down, they were put into the shelf, and there they sat. We do not know how these books were used. We could construct some hypotheses on that, but generally they were, as we use our research, for example, for the papers we wrote, we have it on a hard drive, we put it in our archive, and there they sit. And this was exactly what happened with the cooking recipe texts. Yeah, so my argument is we need to focus on where do we want to go. I find your argument very interesting. I cannot prove it, I cannot refute it because I simply don't know the background of the Liber de coquina. I know the German research to that, and the German scholar says, Andrea Mattilotti, I think the name was, puts the cookbook in the context of the court of Frederick. That's all he says about that. So, and I haven't read the book by Mattilotti, so the idea is really great, but I'm not sure if it works. Talking about the Russian cocktails, or Soviet cocktails, it's something that might work, but I have no expertise on that. So both talks actually generated more questions for me than things I could give back to you. So I don't want to take up more time, and we probably should go on to the discussion so that some of your questions you had at the end of the book and the talk, and some of my questions could maybe be answered in a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Would the speakers like to come up to the front? And before we take questions from the audience, I wondered if the speakers might like to respond to the discussants. So, which one of you would like to go first? Well, if you want to respond.
Is this one working? Yeah. Well, just for the immediate part, for the Italian context, I think it's a little bit easier because there are, at least right after, several copies of almost identical texts that float around, and a lot of people work with them. So there's a lot of direct contact. By the time we're looking at like the 1280s, 1290s, Dante and his other friends in poetry are definitely using texts like this. They cite from them directly. There's a Tuscan redaction. The rest of the background we can believe or not believe, and it really doesn't matter if it was the first one or the 20th one when it came to them, I guess, in that case. But I don't think there's a lack of understanding of the circulation of a text that's there and that's recopied a lot of times, and that exists in many different iterations. I'm not sure as far as identity building, the question that's present at that time. That really wasn't the idea. It's that's how someone later saw the opportunity for a text like this that has otherwise not been seen as part of the kind of systematic construction of power as nonetheless a piece of that. So there would be either anybody in the 13th century Italian peninsula is not interested in nation building or identity building in that specific way. That's the connection to the 19th century when someone picks up on that idea. As far as, I think there's quite a lot of argument over whether or not the original, if the true, scare quotes, original text was actually produced in specifically this moment in this place. Probably just the same then. There were many kinds of texts like that or adjacent that were inspiring that, and they just, one particular version coalesced in a place that had the infrastructure and the presence to then become a node that was of significance, is what I would guess. But I take your point that it would not be possible to ever be sure about that. The entire point is that there is no extant original version. Please, yes.
How do we get there? So the point, Danielle, the point that you made about the immateriality of this, what makes this as a recipe that makes sense or doesn't make sense, the kind of the immaterial aspect of it, I think is really well taken. And in that sense, I think this question brings up that question of success and failure of these recipes. And from our perspective, they seem to flop so spectacularly. And for Lithuanian peasants who moved to cities, this was just absurdity. And only like recently, after this presentation, PowerPoints were sent, I kept thinking, well, the Soviets succeeded in inserting the state into the recipe book that read very kind of nationalist and kind of disrupted that narrative that you can be Lithuanian, you can just focus on potatoes, but you can be a Lithuanian. And then they kind of throw in this category of drinks that is all over the place, and it kind of disrupts the flow. And maybe this is the success that is really working to make the state legible in that context and bring that immateriality of these recipes to make that state very much present. The other point was about the mobility of these terms, champagne and cognac, and how present they were in these recipes, and how there is aspirational kind of culture about the West. I managed to get these trade books of drinks from the Soviet Ministry of Food that was for internal use within the ministry. And they had these recipes of all kind of liqueurs, bitters from the West, along with the local from the Baltic states in particular. During the independence, they were delivering and making their own bitters and liqueurs and cocktails. So they had even like chartreuse, which is supposedly secret. They have a recipe for chartreuse outlined, and not without instructions how to make it, but really what goes in it, which is very kind of striking. Like, how did they get there, and what it took.
Share that one. I would like that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, as he's disappearing from the shelves in the United States. So, it's also, I think, the cocktail as a term is used directly, cocktaili in Russian and Slavic, and in Yugoslavia. I have this absolutely beautifully made copy of a Serbian cocktail book, which is much more closer to Western cocktails, even though they throw in also some of these different kind of categories, and they use bananas to put together on the glass and the kind of other things. But they were much more open and actually had an open border with Italy. So a lot of aperitivo culture comes into these, and they are much more better produced with colorful pictures, as opposed to the Soviet books that are black and white and or just several colorful pictures of dishes rather than drinks. So this mobility is very important, the materiality is very important, somatic aspect is important. I think that also in partly answers Helmut's question, like why do they create recipes? And I think that success and failure, I think for the state to insert and bring in these into being this different category, I think this was important. Because there seems to be, despite the fact that I do not have the direct evidence of being instructed to create these cocktails, they did, seems to be all republics had them, Yugoslavia had them, like it's such an overwhelmingly homogeneous effort to kind of create the cocktail culture that seems to be out of step with what is happening there. So I assume the state is coming from up there.
Great, thank you. I can see a number of questions. Shall I give you the microphone? Oh, now I've got to think. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think who came first. The one at the back in the pink shirt. Let's go with that as a beginning point.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I have Danielle Newman right here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, Danielle and Michelle also had their hands up. And at the front, Ariana.
Thank you very much for both very engaging and thought-provoking presentations and post-mortems. I have I have just two very brief points. The first is about identity. And I think the identity building point that Danielle made is a very valid one, but I think that whilst that may apply across the board, identity preservation, I believe, was a very important element. And there is proof of that across the medieval literature, which brings me to the point of the cookery books. We seem to assume that all the recipes in the cookery books were actually written down in order to be made. I believe this is a profound fallacy, because in many respects, and I can think of one example, at least in the Arabic tradition, where the author very openly declares his intention to produce an anthology. Just as we would do still today, I'm sure there's many people present here who have cookery books, recipe collections of their family that we keep without necessarily ever, A, have eaten those dishes, and B, without feeling the need to make them. So the identity preservation, consciously or subconsciously, I believe was a very important element. And the second point is about the uses of the cookery books. And there I disagree with Danielle. I think that some of them were actually used in kitchens, because once again, in many of these cookery books, they were written by chefs for chefs. And the final kind of buttressing argument is that the cookery books were often split up. And so you would have the section, say, on desserts, which would circulate separately. And incidentally, this may also explain why so many of the manuscripts got lost, because they were used in these unfavorable conditions.
Yeah, I actually think we agree 100% on all points, because my point, what I was trying to say today in brief time, is that there's a distinction between the desire to codify and inscribe on one side, but then also have, and in fact, I think I did say that the thing that makes these books so incredible as a genre more broadly is that they are both things, right? They are, in fact, an opportunity to put down in a way that looks like a serious book in the sense of its structure, format, the content, and the sometimes purposeful elision of certain information or inclusion of information that is to be there for even perhaps only aesthetic purpose rather than any practical one, but also to imply that an educated person would already have that information, not necessarily a practically educated person, but an educated person about world cuisines, for example, or elite cuisine. On the other hand, they are at the same time leaning toward, in certain iterations, and then other times very specifically meant to be practical. And what I'm saying is that the one I'm talking about, the ones that have been preserved to us, since we were talking about the recipes that get splattered yesterday, are the ones that are copies of things that were meant for the exaltation rather than practice, whereas the pieces that create that vast, complicated web of fragments, because in fact so much of what we have as fragments is left over from, in fact, real day-to-day use. And probably we could even say that there are many, many other layers there, because there would have been, at certain points, a head of household, and then, to your point, several people who have specific expertise in various areas of the kitchen, who are then also within them professionalizing at hierarchical levels as time goes on, and that becomes more available, especially on the Italian peninsula, where the difference between being in the 12th century and the 16th century is radical in terms of how many people can have a full household staff, but also in terms of the incoming presence of influences from French and Spanish regal homes. So I 100% agree with that. I think that that's what makes this so exciting from the point of view of a true literary scholar, that these texts all inhabit the same place. And for people who work in literature, there has been a strong tendency to separate those, because a practical manual and something worthy of our attention in the canon cannot co-inhabit the same space. But I think very much they do, in fact, is the point. Absolutely, yeah.
Chair, we still have 3 questions and our time is up. What if I collect all the questions and the speakers answer to all 3? What do you think? Short question, please.
So I have one question for Danielle and one for Diana. Listening to your presentation about Frederick II, I thought about other cookbooks that came out later on, like Maestro Martino. Maestro Martino, for instance, has a very broad spectrum of recipes coming from other parts of the peninsula and also other parts of the Mediterranean. And I was wondering if you found that in Federico II's cookbook. And also, if you found any similarities or differences between his cookbook and his book on falconry in terms of design, style, narrative, use of imagery, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so structurally, sorry.
And for Diana is a comment / question. You made me think about the Futurist cookbook by Marinetti, and I was wondering if you found any connection, because I know that futurism had an impact in Soviet art production later on. And so I was wondering if you found any connection between these unrealizable, untasty, unsavory drinks and the drinks or the recipes that he proposes in his cookbook that are as well unsavory, untasty, unrealizable.
Taking two more questions.
Yes, I'll try to be very brief. So my question is specifically for Diana, but it follows also the model that Dr. Callegari presented as, the recipe and the gastronomic collection as an instrument for the implementation of policy. And in this case specifically, I am aware of that around the time period that these cookbooks were produced, Soviet leadership, and I'm not sure if it's the case in Lithuania, but Soviet leadership had a preoccupation with alcoholism. And specifically, it was a public health issue that was less publicized, and specifically with the consumption of liquor, neat. So my question specifically is like, if within these cookbooks, did you find any traces? Did you find any references to these cocktails as a possible substitution or as a possible discouragement from the consumption of alcohol? And also if this dietetic, you mentioned it at the beginning, the food should be good, should be healthy, but it doesn't need to be good. So if this dietetic lens, how can it contribute to the research that you already presented? That's very interesting.
Michelle King for the last question.
Thank you so much. So interesting. I think the thing for me that brings together your papers is the performance of status, and that this is all about, I don't know anything about the Italian context, but, at least for the, Lithuanian or Soviet cocktails, it's the idea of performing what a cocktail is. They have no clue. They have no idea. They've never tasted one. But oh, it must have a dairy product in it, and it must have alcohol in it. And we're imagining what that could be. So in fact, it doesn't even matter what it tastes like, because it's not about that. It's about the performance of a kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of knowledge of Western, what is the West and all that sort of thing. I think of like an example of like in China in the 80s, you would see people had like, Western, whatever, Arabic letters spelling out nonsense. It didn't spell out any words. It doesn't matter. It's about having the status of those, whatever Western alphabet on your sweater or whatever. And I think that, in terms of food, there's always that layer of the performance of status. In China today, people order abalone. Is it because it tastes good? No, it's because your guests know you spent a lot of money to put it on the table, right? So that idea of, in fact, like success or failure doesn't seem to really matter. It is a success because what you're demonstrating is this vision of what could be, and this is my vision of, not my or whoever wrote these things, their vision of what a cocktail is, because they have no idea. And that's fascinating. I mean, that whole aspect to me is what this is. Both of these papers are united by that kind of status question.
Can we start to answer that? Okay. I have one to overall answer that I think links all of that, which is exactly that there's a lot of performance. It doesn't mean that you couldn't also make the recipes or that someone wasn't sometimes, as in the case, no doubt, with the cocktails. If they managed to come up with it, maybe people were trying it. The point was that what you write, especially speaking of that, back to the distinction between an oral tradition or a written tradition, what you write down is what you know people are going to get coming to them, right? So when it comes to the things that get folded into that place, that's at least some of those choices will have been made with an effort towards making sure that other people knew you knew about those things. Maybe also you did make them and love them, but the selection is, and that's what happens. Speaking of the cookbooks that we still have today, as we know, in fact, many people here have probably participated in some kind of editorial process or made or written a cookbook or adjacent themselves here. You know that what goes in is important. What gets left out is equally important. You're curating a vision of who you want to present or what you want to present. So as far as identity building goes, when we look at the really broad swath, that's not possible. But as we move towards a more modern / contemporary iteration of the genre, that's when you can start seeing that really coalesce more precisely. But to the point of, does it look a lot like his falconry treatise? There's that's where a lot of this comes from in the first place. The idea is that this was every box must be checked. So the ability to formulate it in a way that can be received like that was important, absolutely. And I'll let.
Thank you. Marinette, yes. Definitely there is this imaginary work happening of like what progress is and how do you break this historical rupture is in these recipes. But I think it matters that it is produced by the state. These books were not specifically publishing houses, independent houses. They were the state government censored, reviewed, approved textbooks or recipe books. So I think it matters that it comes from that perspective. Substitution and the politics of alcoholism and the campaigns against drinking in the workplace is very much part of the era kind of discussion, and the party definitely was talking like, you are not a good worker if you are coming to work to drink. But the recipe books does not really have the kind of didactic element in it. It doesn't have any suggestion of that at all. The fact that they are kind of mixed in, like there's some of them, they are alcoholic, some of them are not alcoholic. I could not discern the pattern, how it's qualified. And in fact, there are 3 types of cocktails that are introduced in this the cookbook is that first drinks are dairy-based, second are sweet dessert, and third is the strong ones. So it's very hard to know which one belongs to which one, but that's all the kind of, you drink them after lunch or dinner. So it's not an aperitivo, like it's kind of like this teaching, which brings me to Michelle's question, like how it just, what do you do with them? It resemble the West. They do resemble the West. And at the same time, that class politics is complicated because from the perspective in Lithuania and the other Baltic states, it's read very much through anti-colonial kind of sentiment, that this is the Russians coming to us and they are bringing their vodka because vodka is very Slavic, and the Balts are like, no way, we're not, and like very strong sense of that. And instead is kind of through the back door of it comes very important notion of culturedness that is coming from Russian imperial narratives of like, we are different from the West because we are very cultured. We are like, popular culture doesn't matter. We are actually trying to produce the high art, and our proletarian workers are writing poetry, right? There is all this sense of like culturedness, and I think that comes across as part of this kind of educational, like what it means to be cultured is to have this sophistication of drinks and preparation methods, and I think that that is a very good point that I will try to develop. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the panel. This was excellent. I've really enjoyed the talk.